Yeah.
came to Albert Block, basically the story when you were at Nelson
Yeah.
Atkins Curator of American Art, how you came into the project.
I learned about Albert Block very shortly after I came to the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, and right around that time, Anna Block basically showed up at the museum with a group of paintings that were in very bad condition that had been stored in the attic up in the house in Kansas. So originally they'd been stored in a trunk, and I think that she had unfolded them a little bit, but they were still quite dark and dirty. Anyway, she brought them to the conservator at the museum, and it turned out that two of these paintings had been in the Blue Rider exhibition. And I had actually never heard of Albert Block, but I had heard of the Blue Rider exhibition, and I knew it was one of the key exhibitions in the whole history of modern art. It really was a defining moment for the modern movement. And then I learned that Block was really one of the core group of 6 artists in the Blue Rider group. And you know, I was somewhat startled that I hadn't heard of him before. So that really, it was largely through Scott Heffley, the conservator, that the whole process started up of investigating his career and trying to do something more with it. Actually, the next stage of the project, I had actually done a show that went to Lugano, Switzerland, and I thought, well, you know, Switzerland and Germany aren't too far apart. Why don't I go to Munich? And I knew that there was the Lenbach House in Munich, which is a museum largely devoted to artists of the Blue Rider. Now, I, in some ways, am not at all fit to be doing an Albert Block show because my German is very poor. I know very little about German painting, and I basically showed up at the door of the Lenbach House. I guess I'd send them some kind of fax to say I was arriving, and I suggested that we do an Albert Block exhibition together, and to my amazement, they said yes. So that's sort of how the project got started.
Tell us, if you will, what you felt the aims of the Blue Rider movement were and how the block fit into that picture at the turn of the century.
I think the Blue Rider movement has a number of aspects. In terms of the history of modern art, it's a key moment because it's the first international show of modern art held anywhere. It was the first attempt to bring together artists not only from France, but from Germany, from Russia, from the United States, from different parts of the world, and to kind of distill the spirit of the modern movement as a kind of international venture. So that in sort of historical terms, that's the significance of it. I think for the artists of the Blue Rider, the key to the movement was a kind of spiritual sense, that there was, those artists had a strong feeling that there was a need for a kind of spiritual regeneration of Western culture, and that they hoped that through their painting and through this exhibition they could start a kind of spiritual renaissance.
Why Albert Block? Why would Kandinsky, Franz Marc and Wassily Kandinsky, these giants, these luminaries of early modernism, turn to Albert Block, an unknown, unschooled, essentially, painter from America?
Well, of course, it's very strange that Albert Block was included in the Blue Rider exhibition. This had never really been explored very much before, and in some ways when we did research and started to pin it down, it became almost stranger because, in fact, Franz Marc and Kandinsky only met Albert Block a month or two before they had this exhibition. I think the appeal of Block was that here was this largely self-taught painter from the United States. He had just had a few very brief painting lessons, but he really taught out of a kind of inner spiritual conviction and not at all in an academic way. And I think that this was very exciting, probably particularly to Kandinsky, who was interested in self-taught artists. And it was a kind of reaffirmation of what Kandinsky was interested in, an art that was based on a kind of spiritual awareness rather than this kind of boring technical skill that they taught in the art schools at that time. this was art that was not like a photograph. This was something that had a kind of human and spiritual energy behind it.
If you could, for me, just kind of explain the origin of the name Blue Rider.
The Blue Rider is kind of an odd term, but it's an image that shows up very often in Kandinsky's paintings of a knight or soldier on armor, often a St. George figure who's battling the dragon or whatever. And he really stands for a kind of idealism in combating the evil forces. And the color blue for the artists of that period, and in fact there's quite a tradition of this in German literature and painting, but blue was thought to be a spiritual color. It's the color of the sky. It's a kind of disembodied, ethereal color. And so the Blue Rider was a kind of shorthand for this kind of spiritual quest that they were interested in.
There's a community of artists in Munich that formed the Blue Rider, the Blau Rider. Was Bloch taken into the inner circle, or was he on the outskirts?
I think in dealing with Bloch's role within the Blue Rider group, it's one of those sort of questions of whether the glass is half full or half empty, and depending on how you look at it, you can see him as very much part of the inner circle or as a little bit separate. I think that Bloch was always a very independent, in some ways even a somewhat ornery character who was very interested in maintaining his own point of view. He was not really a joiner. He was a kind of contrary personality in some ways. On the other hand, it's clear that particularly in the period of a few years right after the Blue Rider exhibition, that he was very close to this group of artists. There's an interview with Gabriele Munter where she mentions that Bloch was one of the closest friends of she and Kandinsky, and we know that Bloch went out and he visited Franz Marc in the country, and they exchanged paintings, and they wrote letters to each other and sent sketches to each other. And so I think it was a very warm friendship with that group. I think that one thing that's hard for us to conceive today is what a small scale the art world existed on and how innocent it was in some ways. It wasn't at all the kind of commercial venture that we're so accustomed to today. And in that way, I think this association of friends was much more informal than what we're now accustomed to in the art world, where getting an art movement together is almost like planning a military operation these days. And I think in that period it was much simpler and more innocent.
Bloch is often accused of being derivative of the influences